Worldwide parent coach and conscious educator Sue DeCaro is on a mission to revitalize the joy in parenting. Welcome to Conscious Parents, Thriving Kids, a podcast designed to help parents all over the world create deeper connections with themselves and their children while overcoming life's daily parenting challenges. Listen in if you want to bring more laughter, love, and enjoyment to your home life.
Welcome to Conscious Parents, Thriving Kids, a place for all things parenting. I am your host, Sue DeCaro. I am thrilled to introduce my special guest for today's episode, Oona Hanson. Oona is a parent coach who has been in education for over 20 years. She loves supporting parents of teens and tweens as they navigate the challenges of adolescence. Passionate about helping parents raise kids who have a healthy relationship with food and their body, Oona writes and gives talks on fostering body image resilience and lowering the risk for eating disorders. Launched during the pandemic summer of 2020, her Common Sense Camp offers a framework for teaching kids essential life skills at home. Oona holds a master's degree in educational psychology and in English. Her work has been featured widely, including CNN, Today, Good Morning America, Good Day LA, and many more. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 2 children. Welcome, Oona. It's a pleasure to have you join me today.
Happy to be here.
So let's dive in. I love that you're so passionate about helping families really understand the relationship that we have to food. Tell me a little bit about where that starts in terms of how we foster good relationships from the get-go.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's hard, I'll start with what's hard for parents. I think it's hard in our current food culture, which is a diet culture, where we get messages about what healthy eating is supposed to look like. And it's a very narrow kind of black and white thinking kind of approach to food, looking at food only as sort of a macro or micronutrient delivery system or something that you could reduce to, numbers on a label. And so I think it's really important for parents to kind of come back to the basics and remember that food is so much more than just, those numbers. Food is love, it's connection, it's belonging, it's your culture. And we nourish our families in so many ways around the dinner table. And so I think it's helpful for parents to kind of tap into those, I think that inner wisdom about, what family meals can be, and try to tune out some of the messages from our culture, sort of eat this, not that, or trying to micromanage how our kids eat. So I really try to help parents kind of push back a little bit on some of the misleading and potentially harmful messages out there about what food should be in our families.
Well, I think that you touched on a number of things. The should be, what it should look like, and the nurturing around the dinner table. And, it's interesting how powerful words are in so many ways, but certainly when it comes to food, I can still remember my mom telling me, don't eat that muffin because it had 1,000 calories. I mean, it must have been 8. And, at 8, who's even thinking about calories? I didn't know the difference between, 1 calorie and another. So how is it that we can shift, in your opinion, the conditioning that has already taken place? Sadly, I don't have a great relationship with muffins, but it's more intentional now than it is from those words. But when you think about a story like that, many parents have been raised in this type of environment with heavy conditioning about food, and food is love, and finish everything on your plate. They're starving children, right? All of these things. What are some tips that you can offer our listeners today about their own conditioning and how to look at it?
Right. I mean, we all come to parenthood with our own history, right? Our own relationship with food and our body and movement. So it is important for parents who really struggle with body image issues or a history of disordered eating or chronic dieting. It's really important for parents to take care of themselves. There are incredible resources out there for anyone who wants to kind of work on some of those issues. I think One of the most important things is to remember just sort of basic psychology, right? When we're raising kids, when we try to force kids to eat something, they're actually going to be less likely to want to eat that, not only in that moment, but farther down the road. Um, the same thing goes with trying to hold food back from a kid, right? If you're worried that your kid is overeating and you try to control their portions or question, like, are you sure you want the second muffin? Um, that only makes kids feel that food is a scarce resource and maybe they're not going to be allowed to eat enough when they're hungry. And so it actually drives kids to eat more. So there's this interesting thing that happens when parents let kids have a say over their own hunger and fullness. And everybody wins, right? Dinner time, it becomes much less stressful. No more negotiating, bribing, cajoling, threatening. If we can really, present a variety of options of food that we enjoy, and our kids get to decide how much to eat and what to eat, and it really restores that family meal back to what it should be, which is this time of connection. And yes, you're getting nourished, in terms of, nutrition and calories and energy, but you're also being nourished in all those other ways. You can have much more interesting conversations when everyone isn't feeling anxious about who's eating what or not eating enough or eating too much of something. It really brings a lot of peace to the family, and it sets your kids up to kind of break that cycle of struggling with food and body and diet. So it's not easy. You don't just flip the switch and turn off decades of programming that, like, we should be eating a certain way. So it does take time. I think parents should be gentle with themselves. I mean, it makes sense if if you've been doing keto or intermittent fasting or any of these sort of trendy diets. I don't want parents to feel guilty about that. I mean, it makes sense that you would think that was the right thing to do. And so just being, showing yourself compassion. And then with older kids, you can say to them, look, I realize I've been kind of eating according to what some book told me or an app told me to, I want to get back to basics and listen to my body, because listening to our intuition is so powerful. And, it even has implications beyond the dinner table. I think about, there's been a lot of talk about consent with kids and families. And think about it. If you have a young child sitting there and you're, forcing them to eat something, you have to clean your plate. The message is, I shouldn't listen to my body. Instead, I have to bend to the will of someone who's pressuring me, who has more power than me. Maybe my body can't be trusted. Maybe I should always just listen to what someone tells me to do, and that my inner, wisdom doesn't matter. So when you extrapolate out from the dinner table into their young adulthood or their teenage years, I mean, you can see how powerful these conversations at dinner can be. So I think it's really important for parents to just take a deep breath and, try to get back to some basics, some common sense. And, there's a lot of help out there if you need help kind of unlearning the diet culture way of doing things.
Wow, I love all that you just shared. And I think that it's such an important point, not that they're all not important, but that you talked about in terms of listening to your body. I've done podcasts before where we talk about, enforcing kids to go give grandma a hug or grandpa a hug, and I've never heard it in relationship to, the fact that we need to listen to our body when we're hungry or we're not hungry and just stop. In our society, that's not something that, in my opinion, is so common that we're taught. So, I really think that's a very, very important and powerful way to help our children and to help ourselves to model that as parents, listening to our own bodies when we've had enough. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is how we verbalize these things. So, keto diet, like you said, again, no judgment here, whatever we're doing, I don't eat grains or dairy or gluten because I have allergies, but I don't talk about that all day long. I can't have this, I can't have that. So when we're talking in front of our children, how can we put language to the positivity and intentionality of what we want to put forward in terms of nutrition, health, and not bodies and fat and, the calorie count in a muffin? What kind of language do you suggest is helpful for parents to focus on?
Right. I don't think we have to teach young kids anything about nutrition in the way that we think about nutrition, right? We think about nutrition as, again, micronutrients, macronutrients, we really can get into the weeds with young kids, and it's really counterproductive. And a lot of, very well-meaning teachers and health curriculum designers, will try to send the message to young kids that they should only have X amount of sugar, and you have to have a balanced plate that looks a certain way at every meal. And young kids are very concrete thinkers, and they can take a message that might have a kernel of good sense to it, but then they can kind of take a black and white approach that can lead to fear or fixation, restriction, binging. So with kids, it's really important to steer clear, I think, even of words like healthy and unhealthy. We tend to label foods in our culture, but the thing is, there's really no such thing as a healthy or unhealthy food. That might sound shocking to some of your listeners. But there's healthy and unhealthy food behaviors. So I'll give you an example, a green apple and a cheeseburger, right? And it could be a veggie burger with a gluten-free bun, if for you. So, and, vegan cheese. So, people would say, oh, well, the apple is healthier. So I say to parents, well, what if your child only ate green apples, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and every snack? They would feel terrible physically, right? They would become malnourished. And that would be a very unhealthy behavior. If the burger, or pick whatever kind of food, is sort of demonized in our culture, at the moment, and it changes all the time. Right? It was fat when I was growing up, now it's sugar. So you pick whatever food, you think of as sort of unhealthy. Well, then you imagine, the family gathering, well, when we can have gatherings again, where that's the food that's offered, and your child is so afraid of that food that they can't participate in this gathering. And I'm not talking about allergies, right? That's a separate issue. But if they're so afraid of it that they don't eat, they can't participate in this gathering, they're missing out on so much more than just the nutrition. So again, foods themselves, they always have a context. So I think it's important for parents to steer clear of labeling food that's healthy or unhealthy. Instead, the language you want to use, things like variety. So, you might say, wow, we've had pizza 3 nights this week. I'm kind of in the mood to mix it up. Let's have a little variety. What do you guys want to add in this week? Also really focusing on satisfaction. There's a lot of diet culture messages that will say things like, before you go to a party, eat a lot of crudité to fill up before you go. And, eating a lot of raw vegetables, it's often not very satisfying, right? That's just probably not going to feel very good physically. And you might be full physically, but you're not satisfied, right? You need to have a variety of things. And then also pleasure. I think our culture has demonized comfort food and enjoying food. And that's, it's a shame. And I think, during the pandemic, there was a brief moment where everyone was sort of baking bread and serving all these nostalgic favorites for their families. And then there was sort of that panic mode that people went into, like, oh no, my kids are only going to eat mac and cheese and muffins for the rest of their life. And I think there was sort of just that kind of sense of fear. But really, if we can allow kids to find comfort and joy in food, that's a great thing. I mean, we don't want that to be their only comfort, their only coping strategy. We want kids to have a grab bag of tricks to use when they're stressed or bored or tired or lonely. But there's nothing inherently wrong with taking comfort in food. Human beings are hardwired to seek comfort in food. And again, we think about, celebration. I know we're celebrating in isolation now, but if it's somebody's birthday, and there's a cupcake, most people, you don't eat cupcakes usually because you're hungry, like physical stomach hunger. You're eating a cupcake because it's joyful, it's celebratory, and it tastes delicious. So I think, variety, satisfaction, and pleasure, that will help parents, I think, cover all the bases. And you're going to have, variety has, the food groups built in, and so does satisfaction, right? When you have just sort of one kind of thing, you're not usually very satisfied. So satisfaction, variety, and pleasure, I really think you can't go wrong with those.
That's beautiful. I'm going to continue to eat my comfort food.
Good.
And I think you're right. We have demonized the whole comfort food, but if it does bring us comfort, and not that you're sitting there eating, boxes and boxes of Oreo cookies or whatever it might be, but some amount of comfort, what's wrong with that? I love that you shared that. I wanted to touch on how you would define, here we are talking about healthy eating and, healthy eating in terms of having a good relationship with food, not the healthy eating. And talking about eating disorders or disorderly eating. And I wondered if you might take a step back and offer us a definition of what that really is, both disorderly eating and an eating disorder. I think parents need to understand what that is. It's not really your child had 14 cookies tonight, so they must have an eating disorder. Can you share in your
Right.
words?
Those are a lot of big topics. Let me see. I think first off, I think people, when they hear the words eating disorder, they have a very specific image in their mind that has been perpetuated by the media over the years, right? I think you're probably picturing, let me guess, a very thin, white, affluent girl who's getting straight A's. She's probably a teenager. And certainly eating disorders do affect that population. But that's not the typical person with an eating disorder, actually. So even though they're sort of the poster child for eating disorders, anyone can be affected by an eating disorder. It doesn't matter your gender, your race, your socioeconomic background. And I will say, actually, people of color are at higher risk for eating disorders. They're a very underdiagnosed and undertreated population. Same goes for males. I think men and boys are developing eating disorders at higher and higher rates because of the sort of the fitness and wellness marketing to boys and men. And also people in larger bodies. I think people assume that if you're in a larger body, you can't have an eating disorder. So I really want to separate out, if you see a thin person, it doesn't mean they have anorexia. If you see a heavier person, it doesn't mean they have binge eating disorder. Anybody in any body size or shape can have any of the eating disorders. So, disordered eating is anything where your relationship with food is anything other than sort of like listening to your hunger and fullness and your pleasure and just sort of like a social, what I would consider like sort of the normal healthy way of eating. So any kind of dieting is inherently disordered eating because you're choosing foods, in a way to try to control your shape or your weight. Of course, we know it doesn't actually work for most people. 95+% of people who intentionally, diet to lose weight will gain it back, and 2/3 of those will gain more than they lost. So dieting is actually a predictor of weight gain, not weight loss. There's nothing inherently wrong with weight gain. It's part of life, right? It's especially like puberty is like a really rapid weight gain. And so our kids need to be, taught about that. And then as we age, it is normal to gain weight as we age. And it actually can offer a lot of protective health factors, but we've been told to be terrified of weight gain. So disordered eating is anything where you're, kind of that low level dieting, or you have like these rules for yourself that aren't coming from your own internal wisdom. So it's funny because that's sort of the way most people eat. I think we've lost our intuitive relationship with food in a lot of ways. But disordered eating just means that it's not meeting the criteria in the DSM-5 for a clinical eating disorder. And then, eating disorders, there's very specific, criteria for those. And I don't know if I didn't get all your questions. I'm trying to remember what you had.
No, that's you definitely did answer the questions, and I think that it can be very confusing for many people, and the rules and restrictions, as you beautifully pointed out, having such stringency and strictness and rules for yourself. You can't touch this and you can't touch that, and you can only eat this between 12 and 2, and et cetera, is not necessarily listening to your body. It is letting your mind and mental state take over the decisions to serve your body. Correct?
Right. And, that kind of rigidity, I'm glad you brought up the clock thing, because there's a lot of like, don't eat after a certain time at night, or, these external rules. And when people get really rigid about them, like we were just talking about comfort food. We worry a lot about like comfort eating and eating for stress. Well, being rigid about food can be also like an unhealthy coping strategy, right? If you are sort of living by the clock or what like the app tells you to do, people will wear their Fitbit and they'll say, oh, I can have that extra slice of whatever because I burned this many, like we're not machines. And I think when we outsource our intuition to a diet book or an app or a smart watch, we really lose a lot. So I think it's worth looking at. And, a particular, sort of subclinical eating disorder that I want to mention is orthorexia, which is the unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. So it's not technically classified as an eating disorder yet. It's probably coming. I mean, it's very similar to anorexia. The biggest difference is that in orthorexia, the person may not be dieting to try to change their body size or shape, but they've heard about clean eating and wellness and eating for health, and that food is medicine, and can become very rigid, right? It's like they can only eat certain kinds of foods, and the number of foods gets smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where it really hurts their well-being and their health, even though they started out trying to eat so-called healthy. So that's a really important one. I think a lot of parents haven't heard of it. And so I think it's important to be aware that your child's sort of new health kick, you want to keep an eye on it, right? If they suddenly come home and say, I want to go vegan, or I want to go gluten-free, and they don't have celiac disease. They've heard certain foods are not healthy, and they want to be healthy, right? This is a good thing. But the problem is that our culture has kind of left us with some misleading and confusing messages. So it's something that parents should definitely keep an eye on. We don't want to always celebrate like, oh, you're being so healthy, right? We really want to know what's going on underneath and kind of what they're thinking about their food and their body, and not just saying like, oh, they're choosing this, kale salad, isn't this great? So, yeah.
Right. And taking pictures and posting it and sharing with all your friends. Yeah, I've never heard that term, but boy, it fits some people I know. And, I also have seen in my own, journey, people who are exercise crazed, I'll call it, for lack of a better word coming to me. But, the restrictions and the expectations on the exercise regimen, 6 miles a day, every day, or whatever the case may be, where they are just pounding the pavement because, again, it's a disordered arena in how we, relate to food, our bodies, and everything else, correct?
Right. I mean, I think there can be someone who runs 6 miles a day and that's their daily self-care and they feel great. And that could be very healthy, right? For someone else, if, let's say, they're injured and they still feel they have to run their 6 miles, or they're sick and they think they have to run the 6 miles, or something disrupts their day and they can't run the 6 miles, and it's taking up a lot of brain space in terms of anxiety and obsession, that's when I would worry, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong of with being a runner and wanting to run every day, as long as there's still that time for rest and flexibility, right? But yeah, I think for a lot of people, exercise is a really good thing for us, right? If we can, especially if we can think of it in terms of how we feel, that we're not pursuing exercise in the diet culture way of like burning a certain amount, or we're trying to shape our body a certain way. But if we're really doing it because we feel good, I think that can be very health promoting. And so I don't think we want to like be afraid of exercise. It's really, again, it's sort of like food, right? It's not healthy or unhealthy. It's the relationship to the movement, right? If it's obsessive, that's when people, might need some help.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I obsessiveness is something that comes from the mind, again, not listening to the body. So if you're obsessively running every single day with, a sore foot or calluses or bunions or pain in some area, but you have to, because you fall into that obsessive need of doing this, then we're not listening to our body. Again, it takes us away from the mind-body connection where, we plan and think, how can I serve myself in the best way?
Right. And that, that can, for some people, the tuning out their feelings is sort of becomes a side benefit, right, of restrictive eating or over exercising, where it has sort of a numbing effect on us. And so it can be very scary for someone to start to break that cycle, because as we rest and as we re-nourish ourselves, a lot of feelings can come out that you maybe haven't felt in a while. So I don't want to make it sound like this is something that's easy, that you just one day say, you know what, I'm going to take it easy and I'm only going to run when I feel like it. It's usually not that easy for someone who's really caught in something obsessive. And that's why I think it's so important for parents to know about these things, because the longer someone has a disordered relationship with food or movement, the harder it is to recover, and the harder it is to treat. So I believe in that, I believe in full recovery from eating disorders. It's possible. it's really hard to get there if you've been entrenched in it for, decades. So when teenagers or even preteens start sending these little warning signs to you about their eating or their movement or their body image, it's really important that we start paying attention and we listen and we get the support that our kids need.
Yeah, I love that. I love the word curious. And when our kids are really young and you see something, be curious, ask questions in a curious way that help your child to explain, not us as adults trying to put, labels and determinations on what that child is actually doing. So
Right.
this is super helpful. I'm sure for all our listeners, it's such an important topic for us to really think about and hone in on and connect with our children in relationship to food, nutrition, body movement, et cetera, to make sure that we're having a intentional discussion about it and a good, solid foundation for our children as they move through their journey. So I wanted to, before we wrap up, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share your Common Sense Camp that you developed this past summer and just what that was, briefly, if you don't mind sharing, because I think it was just brilliant.
Yeah, it's funny. Common Sense Camp started out as a joke between me and my husband about 10 years ago. Whenever our very book smart children would struggle with something that seemed like an obvious, like life skill that they should have picked up just from observing. And so we would turn to each other and say, oh my gosh, our kids need Common Sense Camp. Well, when the pandemic hit and we started getting the notifications that all their summer camps and activities would be canceled, we just had this light bulb moment. Oh my gosh, let's make Common Sense Camp, a reality. And I love a theme. So I ordered t-shirts. My teenager designed the t-shirts. We got camp supplies, like typical things, s'mores and lanyard, string and embroidery thread. But then we also laid out a week by week curriculum to teach our kids life skills, all the things that we think we're going to get to, right? Like, oh yeah, before they go off to college, I'm sure they'll figure out how to do X, Y, and Z. Well, I realized there are a lot of things that we just haven't gotten around to because in the normal hustle and bustle of raising kids, it's really hard to slow down and say, let me teach you how to use a hammer and a nail, or let me teach you, how to read a bank statement. So we were really intentional about setting a theme for each week, and we kept it fun. We also included movies and podcasts. It wasn't all parent driven, but we did decide what the themes were. And then I'm working on developing sort of a supplement for the school year, because I know a lot of families are realizing they'd love to continue this kind of intentional teaching of life skills going into the year, especially as kids often don't have their sports or theater, kind of all those extracurricular things where kids feel useful and like they're contributing. They're not going to have those, at least not in the same way. So this is a way to sort of get those hands-on skills, get them off the Zoom and, help give them these life skills that they're going to have forever. I think we worry about like, oh, they're going to forget some math. They're going to have this learning loss. Well, I think we can give them some really practical skills that we know they're going to use their whole lives.
Which is just brilliant. Again, I'm so glad that 10 years ago you joked about it, and yet during the pandemic, something beautiful came out of your jokes that became life altering opportunities for children, and not just your children, but other children as well. I think it's a great thing to continue moving on with. I mean, many kids go to college. I have college professors that tell me the kids don't know how to do their own laundry, or think they have to get a note if they don't come to school. Like they don't know how to be responsible, or have a feeling of autonomy because they've never been given the space, which is not right or wrong, but let's help our children navigate and have these additional skills as they continue to grow up into young adults. We're raising adults, right? We're raising adults. So they're
Right.
going to need these skills at some point in time. We're not going over to do their laundry.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners that you feel we might have missed?
I think just for parents listening to this during the pandemic and as the school year gets underway, I really think self-compassion and self-care is like number one. I don't want to pile on to-do lists or shoulds for parents. But if we can make sure we, the old, the old line about putting your oxygen mask on first. I think parents really have to be intentional about their own self-care and self-compassion. And that's going to help us be that steady rock, during this really uncertain time. So I just send a lot of, just compassion and support to all the parents out there, because this is, we've never done this before. This is a really big challenge, and it's not always going to be pretty, but we're going to get through it.
Thank you. And I think that is such wise advice. I always tell parents, be gentle with ourselves. We don't learn self-compassion. We learn compassion toward others, but self-compassion is one of the most important things we can do, for sure. And we're modeling that for our children too. Beautiful.
Exactly.
Where can people find out more about you, Oona?
Yeah, so they can find me at my website, which is oonahanson.com. And I finally started posting on Instagram. I was a late adopter for Instagram, but they can find me at Oona_Hanson.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and bringing these wonderful topics to life with your knowledge and your wisdom to help our listeners move forward.
My pleasure.
And listeners, thank you for joining us. Remember, every moment is a new moment for conscious connections.
Thanks for listening to Conscious Parents, Thriving Kids. If you like what you heard, the best compliment you can give us is to share this podcast with a friend. And be sure to give us some stars and a favorable review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in.